Hey everyone, happy Friday. Let's see here, admit all. Somewhere is OBS. Here we go. How are y'all doing today?
Hey everybody.
Got a couple more things. Waiting room. Hope everyone's doing well. Happy Friday.
Oh. How's it going, everybody?
Quick announcement. We've made a decision that this is the 86th week in a row we've been doing these live calls, and we just have too much going on and it just takes too much of our time. So sadly, we're gonna, at least for now, stop having them, the free streaming to YouTube calls.
Right.
The hero group is going strong and growing, and I'll put a link up above. Actually, let's see. Well, is that already there? I'll put a link somewhere else. Let me find a pretty link for it, for a flash discount where we're having a discount price. But yeah. So we'll still have our 2 hours after this and 1 hour tomorrow for like entry level questions. But we're hero members anyway. Exactly. Meanwhile, how can we help anyone here today?
I see a few new people here. I haven't seen them in a while. And probably they have questions. Maybe you can go ahead and ask. If you have any questions, just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask, or you can just type it on the chat if you don't want to talk directly. So I see Ali just mentioning something. I've been using Task Scheduler in Windows to run AHK scripts at different dates and times, and it works pretty well. I was wondering if there are other methods for scheduling AHK scripts. When you say other methods, well, this is the only thing. So in each operating system, like Linux has its own scheduler, Windows has its own scheduler. That's the best way to schedule things because the operating system is already running, right? and it is always running and it knows when to run something. If you use other methods, like for example, we have a script that actually schedules sending some information, then the script must be running. If for whatever reason that script fails or closes, or another program closed it, then your schedules are not going to be, whatever you had scheduled is not going to be running. So I would personally use the Windows scheduling for scheduling stuff 99% of the time, unless you want to have full control. And at that point, then you need a script that does that. But then you have to make sure that the script is always running, which is kind of like the point, right?
Yeah, we years and years ago, Gabe and I, Dr. Cook, the guy that I've done a lot of stuff with him. We created our own, and it just ended up being so much more work than just using the regular task scheduler. We finally just went back to using that. It was solid, and like to your point, Isaias, of just making sure not only is it running, but is it not busy during that exact time, and the task scheduler is kind of independent, and you don't have to worry about it.
That's the point. So two things with the task scheduler. It is from the OS, so it's always running, and it always has priority. The OS actually gives priority to the scheduler above everything else. So if there's something scheduled to run at a specific time, but the computer is busy, I think the scheduler has priority and it tries to run the thing, even though it is still kind of like, it is not, Chris is saying it is not easy to use the Windows task scheduler, but I think you can have it in the command line. So you can use the command line to schedule stuff. So after you figure out what the command is that you can use, then it is a matter of using the format command to just pass the parameters to it. And it is very simple. You can create a little GUI that makes more sense to you. And when you hit save, it just passes the command line interface with the parameters already replaced. So I would definitely give it a try. And so that way you just create an AutoHotkey script that schedules stuff for you, but using the native scheduler, which is a little bit more stable. I think Kaylee had a question. Kylie?
Hello. Just
Hi.
hi. So just some advice really, general, probably, hopefully. When it comes to reading documentation, I kind of get really lost. Is it just practice or is there a way you can get good at reading documentation?
Well,
I think Kylie, easily in 6 or 7 years, it'll be easy.
Okay.
Now the question is, are you referring to AutoHotkey documentation, or you mean in general?
In general, like, yeah, yeah. So I'll share with you my screen, and this is what I'm kind of talking about. So this is this is a kind of screenshot of something that you and I did together. Well, you did it for me actually, Isaiah. And then if I kind of wanted to then go into the documentation and kind of find how you got here, I can't. And so that's kind of what I was thinking about. And then I was kind of reading and then I went and got some. So even in the AutoHotkey, I think, oh, how have they got that from that? And it just, but is it just an experience thing that you just have to get used to, basically?
Not only that, the problem here is that, first of all, each documentation follows its own rules.
Okay.
Second of all, some people are better at documenting than others, right? That's other things. And third, who is the target audience? So for example, MSDN has really good documentation, but the target audience is really advanced. So even if I want to read it, it makes it really hard for me to figure it out. So those three things make it so that each thing you have to approach it in its own way. We have figured that the AutoHotkey documentation is one of the best out there. It's kind of like the easiest we have found for an entry-level person to at least grasp it. But you have to keep in mind some general things that you have to have that foundation first. So let's go to the general documentation, right? And this is one of the things that I think we should talk to them about. I think I could try and do this, but if you go to the first part, I think there is a section about the concepts and conventions that gives you kind of like a general understanding on what to expect at each step when you're reading the documentation. So that's the first thing that I would totally just read, that concepts and conventions. That would give you a solid grasp to understand 99% of what's coming ahead, right? But when you're reading a command, there is something, and this happened to be similar in many other documentations. You see these brackets there? Those brackets mean that that is optional. So let's take a look at the message box command, which is one of the easiest one. It tells you that all the parameters are optional. That means that if I open AutoHotkey and just put the word message box, I should expect something to happen. So that's what the brackets mean. That means I could leave everything empty and it would just go ahead. Now, in some commands, you will notice that one of them is not optional. You have to put something there. That's what it means. So that particular parameter, you have to put it, even if you leave everything else empty. What is going to happen is that most of the times, those parameters depend on the previous one. So some of them are optional, but for some of them are not, depending on what you use there. That's what it's all about. So once you go ahead and take a look at the examples, let's take a look at, for example, let's see. If I have, let's get the function index. Let's get the function index. This is a very good place also to start. The function index gives you a list of all the things that you can do. So in here, if you're looking to do something and you don't know where to start, starting at the index, the function index here is a good place to start, because now you know all the things that you can do. And if you want to see, oh, look at that, that sends a mouse click or a mouse button event to a control specifically. Oh, so I want to do that. Let's click on that and find out more. Now you see that everything is optional. But what I'm looking for basically is one of those that, for example, it has some parameters that are optional and some of them that are not. And I'm trying to get a good, this one is not optional at all. Well, it doesn't matter. Let's just go ahead and grab one. And sometimes what you will find is that the next parameter totally depends on the previous one. Oh, you know, the GUI command is really a good, like the GUI object is really here. The add function, so from this particular command, tells you the control type, tells you the options and the text. But the funny thing is that the options totally depend on which control type you have. So if you open up the text control, the options that you can tell, usually it tells you what you can do. So see the general options. Now for the edit control, for example, not only has the general options, but you can also have certain specific options for it. So you cannot use the limit option with a text control, for example. And you will find that very often in the documentation, in which one parameter depends on the previous one. So you will have to be careful when you read it. But here at the top, it just gives you a very general idea. Some things are optional, some things are not. That's what it says there. After I know that, then I go down and figure a little bit more about what, okay, so in this particular case, what happens? And in this other particular case, what goes on? I hope that gives you an idea on how the AutoHotkey documentation works. Other documentations are not really like that. They might be totally different.
Yeah, let me chime in a little here. The one thing which is pretty consistent overall is when you go to any documentation, you'll see it kind of laid out like AutoHotkey does the top with here's the required, here are optional parameters. Now, they don't always use those exact same characters, but that's very common. What the second note I would say, Kylie, is and this is just me, whenever I use the help in the documentation, I jump right to the bottom and just look at the examples they gave on how to use it, because
Right.
I don't even read the top part unless I go to the bottom and I can't find one close enough that matches to what I'm trying to do. Then I'll go read. And that I'm not saying that's great advice. I'm just telling you what I do, right? And I'm like, it's definitely hindered me as being a better programmer, because people like Isaias and Jackie Stuck, who they go through and read all this stuff and they become much better programmers. I just want to get shit done. So I go and I go, hey, look, they're doing it right there. Oh, I can adapt that to my needs. And I don't even read the documentation usually.
Right. So some people learn better by example. You see a bunch of examples and it is easier, it clicks, right? Some others like me, I like to get the nuances. So I say like, okay, that one option, how does it work? That's why.
The other main thing I want to throw out there is when you learn something new, like when you're completely learning both what the words mean, it's like learning another actual language. Like if you're trying to learn Spanish, but it's like trying to learn how to program in Spanish. You're trying to learn programming and Spanish at the same time. Like when Maestrith was showing me XML and using classes, I was trying to learn XPath, XML, and classes all at once. And it was like, holy cow, right? It was so much, because I couldn't categorize it in my brain properly. But when you baby step into it and you learn one thing at a time, it's much easier. So over time, you'll start digesting what some of these things mean, and it's much easier to process. It does get a lot easier, is my main point, as you get familiar with it.
So it's just a time thing, a time thing.
I think it is.
There is no way to
mainly.
Yeah, okay. And for some people, but the little things, people don't teach how to read documentation. That's why I was happy as to walk a little brief overview, because it really covers how do you actually, like the MSDN is a mess of trying to, when you try to learn it, but man, it's also because that's done in a different language, right? That's in C or C# or whatever, depending on what you're looking at. But
can I just ask a question, please?
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, that AutoHotkey help manual or whatever, I mean, does it at least follow some of the conventions, say from the Unix man format, where you got those brackets there and those optional parameters?
Yeah, well, that is not the same as those in other languages, but it does follow the same in every single one of the commands. So once you get the idea of how they do it, then you can always expect the same. Now, some people have said that the documentation of one language is better than another. I have seen many manuals, and even though they're organized in a way that seems better, when they try to explain what they do, they get really technical. In AutoHotkey, what I have noticed is that I can give this one thing to anybody, and 99% of the people will understand it without having to spend much time trying to understand words are there. This is basically mainly plain English. When I look at Pythons, there's parts of it that are easy to understand, but as soon as you try to do anything advanced, you already have to have knowledge of what you're doing. If you don't have that, it's going to look really foreign to you. Now, if you follow the structure of AutoHotkey's documentation, 99% is going to make sense. And it usually, if I may share the screen one more time, what I see is that 99% of the commands, you're going to see them structured in the same way. A very brief overview of how to use it, what parameters it takes, a little bit description of each parameter, what it returns, and some remarks. All of them follow the same, and at the bottom, some examples. After you get used to that, oh, what should I do with the options parameter? Just go to the parameters, look at the options. This is what it takes. Oh, how do I use it? Oh, go to the examples and you will see them right there. In other manuals, I cannot do that because each command is structured a little bit differently. And I am like, yeah, it takes more time understanding the manual than actually getting the information. This is at least, it's simple because it is a scripting language. It doesn't have that complexity built into it. But yeah, allow me just 1 second, guys. I see that Ray has a question. Maybe you should go ahead and ask the question.
It's related. In message box in the first section, why does it have 2 lines?
You're talking about the documentation? I'm not sure what you're referring. Can you want to share your screen or?
Yeah, I will share my screen. Let me find my cursor. Okay, share my screen. This is the screen that I want to share and share it. Do you see? Why don't you see?
Well, so one is the top one, you're calling it, you're using it as like a command. The second one, you're storing the results, so it's used as a function. So it's just kind of demonstrating, hey, if you're not trying to grab something from it, you can call it directly as above without the parens. So there's no parens, it has the brackets, but no parens.
Right.
And in V2, that's where things change drastically, right? Like, but what I would recommend is just treat everything as a method, as a function. Don't use the commands like it. You don't. The point is, and Isaiah brings up, like, well, you don't have to use it as a function. That's fine, but now I got to learn, to your point, 2 different things. You can always use that second one and just not store the result. It doesn't matter, right? So I personally like to use them as functions and use the parens, even if you don't have to, and then I don't have to think about it. Does that make sense?
Yes, and then in this one,
Same thing. See the parens?
Yeah.
Although, sorry, now I see them at the top. Well, it's used differently. And maybe Tank can jump in on. I see Tank is the admin of the Auto Hockey Forum. I see he's on here on mute, but I don't know if he wants to jump in while Isaiah is out. But
I just came back. So can you confirm again? What was it? So,
he was just asking on this one, why is it listed twice? And I see the
oh, no. So and this is funny. And as you said, Joe, you are the one that you can actually send requests to the documentation. I was the one who requested the change because you can call the same function in 2 different ways. The add, you open the parentheses, and in there, right next to it, you put the control type as the first parameter. That's one of the ways. But there's another way to call it, which is the word add, the control type right next to the word add, and then you just have options in text. If you go down where it says, for example, just stay there. Just go up a little bit. Not where it says, for example, notice that the first one says my GUI add text. You see that?
Yeah.
And the second one says my GUI add edit.
all in one.
In one word. That is a V2 thing that you can, the add method, you can overload it in a way. Well, not overload it. You can call it in a different way, basically. You can call alt add parentheses text or call add text and then the parentheses. And you can do that for any control type.
To summarize, Ray, it's all Isaiah's fault. He just admitted that it's his fault.
No. So here's the thing. It was not documented.
Yeah.
It was not documented. You could do it, but there was no documentation about it. And I told the guy, hold on, let me just add the documentation on all of that. And yeah, they did.
So how about if I just forget about the first one and always focus on the second one? Then
Totally valid.
Then I'd be able to do everything and I would be one less complication in learning.
Totally valid is just a matter of preference. I do exactly what you just said. I use the second version always, and that's it.
It's a matter of learning what to ignore.
Yeah, definitely. Now, and that is the thing. I don't know why they added this second way of doing stuff. It would have been better just to have one way and that's it. But for whatever reason, the AutoHotkey version 2, at least the add command, that's the only one that does that. It does that.
Python, it's one of the things you first think is an annoyance, but later you realize it's a real strength. There's one way to do whatever it is. Like they simplified it to have one loop, one thing of doing stuff. And at first it feels limiting, but boy, it's a blessing because you have to learn one way and then you just use that way. And it's
right.
To me, that's a big strength.
Okay.
There's
thank
like
you.
5 loops in AutoHotkey or something, right? It's
yeah, and the one loop, the word loop itself. So you have while loops, you have for loops, and you have the word loop itself. But that one has like 5 different ways that you can loop, which it makes it a little bit annoying at times.
and the regex loop, I mean, it's like
yeah.
Anyway, anyone got another question? Something to work
Thank
on?
you.
You're welcome.
No, and that's a good question, right? It like I said, back on your very first one, I just use everything as a function. I don't have to think about them as commands. It's fine. It's just when I heard everything in V2 was a function, and then is this like, yeah, but well, you can use them as command. I'm like, I don't la. I don't want to hear.
I didn't. Yeah, like come on, why would you say that?
No.
Exactly. No. I actually there's a lot of little details that is the same as with every single program. Having more flexibility means automatically that you're going to have more complexity. So point Joe, just one need to do stuff, even though it's limited.
It's the same GUIs, right? Hey, GUIs are easy until you make a little more complicated GUI, and then it's complex.
Yeah. How about Anthony? You have another question, right?
Oh, hi. Yeah, thank you so much. I just question about downloading AHK scripts from the web. That's the topic. I mean, is there any security risk to running, like unknown scripts from the web in program files folder, or do most people just put their scripts in, say, the user home directory, like like documents or something like that? Like, what do you suggest?
Well, it is definitely always a security risk to run
Absolutely.
code from somebody else that you don't know. It's the same as running any programs that you don't know. They could do many things. We even created a scanner, a script scanner, that when you drop it, it would list things that we would consider risky, not because they're bad, is that they could be misused, specifically for the purpose of, okay, yeah, I know what I'm doing, but that script is 7,000 lines long. Am I going to read the whole thing to see if they did something wrong? No, I don't. I don't have the time. So I would just drop it there, take a quick look at what it's doing, and then decide what to do. I could decide whether to run it or to verify exactly what is going on. But in general, we don't recommend just bring somebody's code, put your well, when you put it on your program files, it has to happen right away. So that's a security risk right there. I wouldn't put anything there unless I really have to. So I would definitely just recommend that if you're going to run something, just put it on your program, on your documents folder, and then just go from there.
Usually, think of it.
Yeah.
Think of it as if you're out somewhere in a town that you don't know, and you go to get a meal. Or if you don't know that person at all, you're going to be a little more skeptical. If you're familiar, if it's McDonald's, you know what? Hey, it's I still might want to look at it, but hey, it's still McDonald's. I know who it is. If you get something from us, you probably trust us. Maybe you don't have to inspect it so closely. But if it's just a random person, also if it's a pot like for Tank or Isaias or people who post a lot in the forums, hey, I when I find something from them, I don't worry so much about it. But when it's a person I don't recognize, I'm much more scrutinizing of what it is.
That is right.
But we always take, before you launch it, you probably want to take a quick look across it and see what it in the world is doing.
Thank you.
Another quick way of doing that is if you have a virtual machine, kind of like a virtual
Yeah, good
box or
call.
something,
Yeah.
you just run it on that box if you don't trust it or if you don't know what it's doing. So in any case, it just doesn't mess with your computer.
That's a computer condom is a
That's one way of looking at it. That's correct. Sandboxy plus, somebody says here. Yeah, that's really. Now, I
well,
did want to
I'll
mention,
also add, and just because Tank is still,
Yeah.
I see him here. The forum, they have admins always watching what gets posted, and if they see something they think is nefarious or bad, they usually remove it right away, right? But it's hard to watch the thousands of posts. I don't know how many posts are done a day. It's a lot. But it often does get removed. That's why I feel pretty safe when I look at the forum, but it's still,
right. Now, I did want to kind of like add up something that has to do with the topic with the documentation. Kylie, I didn't mention this, but one of the things that you were looking at is a function or method that belonged to the UIA library. That's when it becomes really tricky. When you're programming, you have to know where to look at something in the documentation. So the documentation for AHK is only for AHK. If you're using a library from another person, that person might have its own documentation, which might be good, might be bad. And people who create libraries usually do not focus that much in documentation. So it might be really hard to find information if you're using an advanced library from somebody that didn't take the time to document. Now,
well,
the UIA has some good documentation, but limited, basically.
I would also say, hey, nowadays there's always ChatGPT, right? So take what you get there, shove it into ChatGPT and say, explain this to me like I'm a 2-year-old, right?
Yeah, and it does.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's phenomenal at explaining, going across different levels.
No, but
I
how to use it?
I did try that once, but we were having an argument at the time, so she wasn't very helpful.
She was arguing with you. That was a good one. If you go to the UIA file, so if you open the UIA library file, the AHK file for UIA, there's a lot of comments in there that tell you how the functions, what it expects, and so on. And he did take a time on him to explain it.
Is that's the point also. I have a search tool that when I look up something, it looks at the forum, and then I also look at Stack Overflow. But I think another great point is the documentation is great, but you can just search the forum, or Reddit or Stack Overflow, wherever you want, for examples of someone using it. And often in those examples, because to me, and what as I said earlier, I learn far better by actual examples than I do reading documentation, which I don't always understand the references, this and that, but I can look at the code and kind of make sense of it.
Hey, Joe. Just wanted to kind of pipe in here. It's often, we often talk to people about what to search for and where to search for. But I don't think there's a lot of effort spent on turning things into concepts. So if I have an automation that I want to read a cell from Excel and put it into web page, whatever, we get caught up on trying to look at how to read cell A1. We look up information about that instead of breaking it into the concept of how do I read.
Yes, exactly. That was basically my point when I said that our hotkeys documentation was good.
So we get frustrated because we search for things and we don't find it because we're looking very specific instead of very general.
Right.
Yeah, you have to understand. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, and it actually could be reversed also, right? Where you're looking for too broad when but it's a balancing act of, I would say, start a little more specific and then broaden after if you're not getting what you want, because sometimes some things that's like saying, oh, I need to call a DLL call. Let me just look at that. I'm like, well, if you can find one using the DLL file you were looking at, that's better, probably.
Just
Yeah,
look at this.
that's a good point.
So I got this one. Application enable large operation alert property. It just sets a return a Boolean. What is a Boolean? Not everybody knows what a Boolean is. Now, you need the concept of what a Boolean is to understand this one. And then it doesn't have any other information. Yeah, you have to understand it. So that's it. And that's what I see in many. I see a lot of programming. In this case, it was a Boolean, and most people understand what Boolean means. There's others that just simply say like, no, it returns this type object. Now you have to go and understand what that type is. And now you have to understand what that means. So it is kind of like a rabbit hole going through every single one of them. And to your point, Kylie, is a time thing. After a while reading the documentation and understanding few concepts, then it gets easier over time to understand each of the examples or syntaxes that you will see on the documentation. But that depends on the documentation, how much time they take into explain that. The one that I just showed you is a page that only has 3 paragraphs. You didn't get it from there, you're not going to get they expect you to do a little bit more work. In AutoHotkey, they try to be as plain English as possible in most of the things they do. So does anybody else have any other questions? Anybody has been working on something that they need help with?
Or want to share?
Yeah. Could be comments, it could be anything.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to up my game using OBS, but and I was curious, does anybody? I'm working on a script to to open up like Skype, OBS, and set up some profile in OBS automatically using a AHK script. And I was curious, is that even possible?
That's a good question. Usually when you try to automate programs like that, you would have to understand how they format the files or how they get them. The profiles in OBS are saved as a file, if I remember correctly. You would have to look at one of those files and see how that file works. Now, I don't think there's documentation for that. So what you're trying to do is kind of a little bit advanced. And usually what I resort to is just creating it from the OBS GUI directly instead of trying to figure that one out.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, brings up a point. Some programs have their built-in hotkey system, and I believe OBS is one of them. Like Obsidian Notes is another one. And even like LibreOffice built-in hotkey functionality. So,
Right.
I mean, is there a way to integrate the native hotkey functionality to an AHK so it comes in from the outside?
Well, that's where I would just remap a hotkey if I want to change it. Say, if they don't let you change the hotkeys, then I would just remap them.
That's what I was going to say. I think it's a very important distinction to say. Some programs like Office, at least as far as I've seen, they don't let you edit the hotkeys, right? But programs like OBS and Zoom sort of allow you to change some of them, not all of them, and sometimes like Zoom lets you make some global and some not global. Where okay, if I'm not on that active program, they'll work everywhere. But to Azace's point, what I often do is just say, screw it. I'm not going to mess with that program. I'm just going to remap my key with AutoHotkey to send the hotkey that they're expecting.
Yeah.
But it just depends on what your goals are, and if it's available,
and how much time you plan to, how much time you're willing to spend understanding it.
Another really, really big important one to take into account is, hey, am I going to share this with other people? Right? Because if you want something to give to other people, then you leave everything default in your tool, and you write a script to send that other key, because otherwise you're like, oh, you have to go in here and configure these, or maybe there's an XML file you can give them that would do it for them, but that's just a holy mess.
I think that's the best thing. Usually, whenever I try to create a program, the first question is, am I going to share it? Because that usually opens a can of worms that you usually don't want to open. You want to leave it as is, right? So it is something that.
And actually, I would slightly say it differently, Isaias, because is this program going to run on multiple computers, whether I'm sharing it with other people or for myself on different computers I'm using, right?
Yeah.
Because then I have to go apply those settings on every computer separately versus, hey, I have one approach that works everywhere.
Yeah.
You had mentioned like using a virtual machine to demo AHK scripts, but like where I'm just a home user, right? So is there a place that Microsoft gives away images of Windows that I could
Windows
make
10,
yeah.
Windows 10 and 11, I think, have built-in sandboxes that you can create, if I remember right.
Yeah.
They're not great. They're not like a completely new environment. An entire thing, but they do have a sandbox that you can use, if I remember right. Is that
And
right?
Windows has this. So if you're trying to just imitate Windows, and we're going to limit ourselves to that, if you Google Windows download tool, they usually have in the download process either download an image or download an executable or something like that. So you can download the image and then use it in a virtual box. It could be VirtualBox, VMware, or the other one that the guy was putting in the chat. In any of those cases, though, you have to have a valid license key, right? So that when you install, you have to put that. If you don't put it, it's still installed, but then it is limited. That's basically what happens.
Okay. I mean, is there any way to say run a test AHK script and test it in like Windows WSL, which is a kind of virtual machine running? Like, is there like a Linux, like a way to run AHK scripts on Linux?
That's a good question. I'm not really sure. I haven't tried that yet.
Yeah, I mean, because that's
technically
the virtual machine that I'm aware of. It's just like doing WSL on Windows.
It might be possible. It is technically doable. The only thing is I haven't done it, so I cannot really answer the question.
Okay, so I guess I should chime in here, Ian, because I do a lot of Linux admin. So we have to understand that AutoHotkey is really just a wrapper for Windows-specific APIs. That's the first thing that we have to understand before we try to tackle such a question. Those Windows APIs, by and large, do not exist within Linux. Now you can do something like Wine within Linux,
Right.
which will give you something of the Windows environment to work in, but there is a bit of sandboxing as well. Thing is, there's nothing you can do in AutoHotkey that you can't also do in Python, which is part of every Linux deployment.
Right.
Hey,
So,
can you speak a little louder?
oh, sorry, I was that AutoHotkey is really just a wrapper for Windows-specific APIs to make the syntax a little friendlier.
Right.
And those APIs necessarily do not exist in the Linux environment. Now, you can use something in Linux like Wine to create something of a Windows API structure, but there's some sandboxing that make it not entirely functional in some cases. However, there's nothing you can do in AutoHotkey that you cannot also do in Python, which is part of all Linux deployments that I've seen.
And just
So Go ahead.
Let me chime in for a second, Tank. So one of the things you keep mentioning is API, and not everybody would know what that is. Just think of an API as a function that you can call at any time. So AutoHotkey just makes those functions that are there be called a little bit easier. When you say message box, you are calling a function called message box. And so it is shorter for you to write because it's MSG box, right? But in reality, you're calling a whole function that is a bit more complicated than what you might expect. That is easy for you to call it, but the underlying function that you're calling is a little bit more complex. So AutoHotkey is just making it easier to call. And what Tank is saying is that in Linux, you might not have a function called message box exactly like that. And AutoHotkey is doing the translation for you, but as AutoHotkey does not work in Linux, it cannot do that translation for you.
I was talking to Tab Nation the other day, and he's like, "Yeah, by the way, I'm on the, I think, beta testers or something where AutoHotkey is coming to Linux," and he mentioned another one. I forget what it was, but I'm like, even when it does, because of what you guys are talking about, I'm like, it's not going to be nearly as powerful because it's just not going to connect in the same way.
Right.
So you can send keystrokes and move the mouse, probably great, but I almost never do that.
Right. So yeah, just keep that in mind when you're doing these kind of things, that any type of script that you're running, AutoHotkey script, is actually making a translation to something a little bit deeper. That translation is not going to work if you're using a Linux computer, for example, or if you're using a Linux VirtualBox, which then you have the Wine translator to try to do that, but it not always works as expected, which is what TAC is really trying to say. So just stick to Windows for now with AutoHotkey, because that's where it works fine, where it works good.
So, by the way, Mage asked about submitting V2 questions on the forum. He was trying to insert code. Is there a problem inserting code on the V2 thread on the forum?
Not that I'm aware of. Tank might answer that a little bit better. But for now, I have been able to. Well, the only thing that I could mention is that the highlighting of the code might look a little bit differently, but everything else should work just fine if you use the code tags. So when you go to any of the forum threads, let me share my screen real quick. So this is what it looks like. And that person is asking something in the AutoHotkey V2, ask for help. You can insert code there. It might just miss some of the highlighting, but that's it. Like, it's just the highlighting. Everything else should be working exactly as expected if you use the code tag. So what I have is the code like this, and then you add the /code like that, and everything you put in between those tags should be then highlighted automatically by the forum into something like this. That's basically what's going on. Any other questions? Any other comments?
Scott was asking, like, why would you be running a Windows environment on a Linux, in the first place? But I'm like, I think just people, if you're already familiar with AutoHotkey, you'd like to take advantage of that and be able to use it on a Linux.
Right. As a general concept, if you're trying to automate Linux, I think Bash is a better. Bash is to Linux like as AutoHotkeys to Windows is basically, but then you would have to learn a new language, basically. Yeah. And of course, you cannot do a lot of things in the GUI as we can with AutoHotkey, by the way.
12 minutes. Who's got some there? Want to help if they're want to brag about?
Yeah, exactly. Any, and all comments are welcome.
I don't know. There's some comments I don't want to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my biggest challenge is like and I know I spoke about this earlier, like in an earlier webinar, is getting AutoHotkey to automatically log into websites. Because I want to, because like I have this like vision, to do browser isolation, which is a way to isolate traffic to certain browsers for privacy reasons. So like only log into Google sites like YouTube, Gmail, and Chrome, and only log into Microsoft sites like Hotmail, LinkedIn, GitHub with Edge, and then everything else, other traffic going to Brave browser. And so like you told me some good tricks to do that in AutoHotkey in prior webinars. So I got that part down. So, but the next part is I'm using KeePass, KeePass password manager to do the login, but KeePass has a protocol to do auto login. But and you gave me some tricks on doing that. So that's like the next step in the journey. So I want to be able to do the browser isolation with AutoHotkey, but then use AutoHotkey to navigate to the login page and to do a query against KeePass to fish out the username, password, and to automatically input those values into the web page. So that's like my open source vision for browser isolation, personal identity protection.
And I'm like, okay, hey, maybe there's an API behind